Nobody ever thinks about the bad girl, because the bad girls are sad. And everybody thinks about the good girl, because the good girls are glad.
Hey everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishineff. We're reading People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We're going to start chapter 6, entitled The Intimately Oppressed. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode, hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell. Let's dig in. It is possible, reading standard histories, to forget half the population of the country. The explorers were men, the landholders and merchants men, the political leaders men, the military figures men. The very invisibility of women, the overlooking of women, is a sign of their submerged status. In this invisibility, they were something like black slaves, and thus slave women faced a double oppression. The biological uniqueness of women, like skin color and facial characteristics for Negroes, became a basis for treating them as inferiors. True, with women there was something more practically important in their biology than skin color, their position as child bearers, but this was not enough to account for the general push backward for all of them in society, even those who did not bear children, or those too young or too old for that. It seems that their physical characteristics became a convenience for men who could use, exploit, and cherish someone who was at the same time servant, sex mate, companion, and bearer, teacher, warden of his children. Societies based on private property and competition, in which monogamous families became practical units for work and socialization, found it especially useful to establish this special status of women, something akin to a house slave in the matter of intimacy and oppression, and yet requiring, because of that intimacy and long-term connection with children, a special patronization, which on occasion, especially in the face of a show of strength, could slip over into treatment as an equal. An oppression so private would turn out hard to uproot. Earlier societies, in America and elsewhere, in which property was held in common and families were extensive and complicated, with aunts and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers all living together, seemed to treat women more as equals than did the white societies that later overran them, bringing civilization and private property. In the Zuni tribes of the Southwest, for instance, extended families, large clans, were based on the woman, whose husband came to live with her family. It was assumed that women owned the houses and the fields belonged to the clans, and the women had equal rights to what was produced. A woman was more secure because she was with her own family, and she could divorce the man when she wanted to, keeping their property. Women in the Plains Indians tribes of the Midwest did not have farming duties, but had a very important place in the tribe as healers, herbalists, and sometimes holy people who gave advice. When bands lost their male leaders, women would become chieftains. Women learned to shoot small bows, and they carried knives, because among the Sioux, a woman was supposed to be able to defend herself against attack. The puberty ceremony of the Sioux was such as to give pride to a young Sioux maiden. "Walk the good road, my daughter," I don't know who he's quoting. Walk the good road, my daughter, and the buffalo herds, wide and dark as cloud shadows moving over the prairie, will follow you. Be dutiful, respectful, gentle, and modest, my daughter, and proud walking. If the pride and the virtue of the women are lost, the spring will come, but the buffalo trails will turn to grass. Be strong with the warm, strong heart of the earth. No people goes down until their women are weak and dishonored. It would be an exaggeration to say that women were treated equally with men, but they were treated with respect, and the communal nature of the society gave them a more important place. The conditions under which white settlers came to America created various situations for women. Where the first settlements consisted almost entirely of men, women were imported as sex slaves, childbearers, companions. In 1619, the year that the first black slaves came to Virginia, 90 women arrived at Jamestown on one ship. Agreeable persons, young and incorrupt, sold with their own consent to settlers as wives, the price to be the cost of their own transportation. Again, he's quoting somebody, and I don't know who he's quoting, and he says to their own consent, but I don't know if that's actually true. Many women came in those early years as indentured servants, often teenage girls, and lived lives not much different from slaves, except that the term of service had an end. They were to be obedient to masters and mistresses. The authors of America's Working Women describe the situation. Baxendall Gordon and Reverby. They were poorly paid and often treated rudely and harshly, deprived of good food and privacy. Of course, these terrible conditions provoked resistance. Living in separate families without much contact with others in their position, indentured servants had one primary path of resistance open to them: passive resistance, trying to do as little work as possible and to create difficulties for their masters and mistresses. Of course, the masters and mistresses did not interpret it that way, but saw the difficult behavior of their servants as sullenness, laziness, malevolence, and stupidity. For instance, the General Court of Connecticut in 1645 ordered that a certain Susan C., for her rebellious carriage toward her mistress, to be sent to the House of Correction and be kept to hard labor and coarse diet, to be brought forth the next lecture day to be publicly corrected, and so to be corrected weekly until order be given to the contrary. Sexual abuse of masters against servant girls became commonplace. The court records of Virginia and other colonies show masters brought into court for this, so we can assume that these were especially flagrant cases. There must have been many more instances never brought to public light. In 1756, Elizabeth Spriggs wrote to her father about her servitude. What we unfortunate English people suffer here is beyond the probability of you in England to conceive. Let it suffice that I, one of the unhappy number, am toiling almost day and night, and very often in the horse's drudgery, with only this comfort that you bitch you do not half enough, and then tied up and whipped to that degree that you not serve an animal, scarce anything but Indian corn and salt to eat, and that even begrudged, nay, many Negroes are better used, almost naked, no shoes, no stockings to wear. What rest we can get is to wrap ourselves up in a blanket and lie upon the ground. Whatever horrors can be imagined in the transport of black slaves to America must be multiplied for black women, who were often 1/3 of the cargo. Slave traders reported, "I saw pregnant women give birth to babies while chained to corpses." Wow. Which our drunken overseers had not removed. Packed spoon fashion, they often gave birth to children in the scalding perspiration from the human cargo. On board the ship was a young Negro woman chained to the deck who had lost her senses soon after she was purchased and taken on board. A woman named Linda Brent, who escaped from slavery, told of another burden. But I now entered on my 15th year, a sad epoch in the life of a slave girl. My master began to whisper foul words in my ear. Young as I was, I could not remain ignorant of their import. My master met me at every turn, reminding me that I belonged to him, and swearing by heaven and earth that he would compel me to submit to him. If I went out for a breath of fresh air after a day of unwearied toil, his footsteps dogged me. If I knelt by my mother's grave, his dark shadow fell on me even there. The light heart which nature had given me became heavy with sad forebodings. Even free white women, not bought as servants or slaves, but as wives of the early settlers, faced special hardships. 18 married women came over on the Mayflower. 3 were pregnant, and one of them gave birth to a dead child before they landed. Childbirth and sickness plagued the women. By the spring, only 4 of those 18 women were still alive. Holy cow! Those who lived, sharing the work of building a life in the wilderness with their men, were often given a special respect because they were so badly needed. And when men died, women often took up the men's work as well. All through the first century and more, women on the American frontier seemed close to equality with their men. But all women were burdened with ideas carried over from England with the colonists, influenced by Christian teachings. English law was summarized in a document of 1632 entitled The Law's Resolution of Women's Rights. In this consolidation, which we call wedlock, is a locking together. It is true that man and wife are one person, but understand in what manner. When a small brook or little river incorporateth with Rhodanus, Humber, or the Thames, the poor rivulet loseth her name. A woman, as soon as she is married, is called covert, that is, veiled, as it were clouded and overshadowed. She hath lost her stream. I may more truly fare away say to a married woman, her new self is her superior, her companion, her master. Julia Spruill describes the women's legal situation in the colonial period. The husband's control over the wife's person extended to the right of giving her chastisement, but he was not entitled to inflict permanent injury or death upon his wife. As for property, besides absolute possession of his wife's personal property and a life estate in her lands, the husband took any other income that might be hers. He collected wages earned by her labor. Naturally, it followed that the proceeds of the joint labor of husband and wife belonged to the husband. Naturally. For a woman to have a child out of wedlock was a crime. and colonial court records are full of cases of women being arraigned for bastardy. The father of the child untouched by the law and on the loose. A colonial periodical of 1747 reproduced a speech of Miss Polly Baker before a court of judicature. There's a new word. Of Miss Polly Baker before a court of judicature at Connecticut near Boston in New England, where she was prosecuted the 5th time for having a bastard child. This speech was Benjamin Franklin's ironic invention. What? Does that mean it's false? It's fiction? Well, it's Benjamin Franklin's invention, I suppose so. Why it's in a history book, I don't know, but let's quote it. May it please the honorable bench to indulge me in a few words. I am a poor, unhappy woman who have no money to fee lawyers to plead for me. This is the 5th time, gentlemen, that I have been dragged before your court on the same account. Twice I have paid heavy fines, and twice have been brought to public punishment for want of money to pay those fines. This may have been agreeable to the laws, and I don't dispute it, but since laws are sometimes unreasonable in themselves, and therefore repealed, and others bear too hard on the subject in particular circumstances, I take the liberty to say that I think this law by which I am punished both unreasonable in itself and severe, and particularly severe with regard to me. Abstracted from the law, I cannot conceive what the nature of my offense is. I have brought five fine children into the world at the risk of my life. I have maintained them well by my own industry without burthening the township. And would have done it better if it had not been for the heavy charges and fines I have paid. Nor has anyone the least cause of complaint against me, unless perhaps the minister of justice, because I have had children without being married, by which they missed a wedding fee. But can this be fault of mine? What must poor young women do, whom customs and nature forbid to solicit the men, and who cannot force themselves upon husbands, when the laws take no care to provide them any, and yet severely punish them if they do their duty without them, the duty of the first and great command of nature and nature's God, increase and multiply, a duty from the steady performance of which nothing has been able to deter me, but for its sake I have hazarded the loss of the public esteem, and have frequently endured public disgrace and punishment, and therefore ought, in my humble opinion, instead of a whipping, to have a statue erected in my memory. Benjamin Franklin. The father's position in the family was expressed in The Spectator, an influential periodical in America and England. Nothing is more gratifying to the mind of man than power or dominion, and as I am the father of a family, I am perpetually taken up in giving out orders, in prescribing duties, in hearing parties, in administering justice, and in distributing rewards and punishments. In short, sir, I look upon my family as a patriarchal sovereignty in which I am myself both king and priest. And modest, too. Man. No wonder that Puritan New England carried over this subjection of women at a trial of a woman for daring to complain about the work a carpenter had done for her. One of the powerful church fathers of Boston, the Reverend John Cotton, said that the husband should obey his wife, and not the wife the husband. That is false principle, for God hath put another law upon women. Wives, be subject to your husbands in all things. a best-selling pocketbook published in London, was widely read in the American colonies in the 1700s. It was called Advice to a Daughter. You must first lay it down for a foundation in general, that there is inequality in sexes, and that for the better economy of the world, the men who were to be the lawgivers had the larger share of reason bestowed upon them, by which means your sex is the better prepared for the compliance that is necessary for the performance of those duties which seem to be most properly assigned to it. Your sex wanteth our reason for your conduct, and our strength for your protection. Ours wanteth your gentleness to soften and to entertain us. Against this powerful education, it is remarkable that women nevertheless rebelled. Women rebels have always faced special disabilities. They live under the daily eye of their masters, and they are isolated one from the other in households, thus missing the daily camaraderie which has given heart to rebels of other oppressed groups. Anne Hutchinson was a religious woman, mother of 13 children, and knowledgeable about healing with herbs. She defied the church fathers in the early years of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by insisting that she and other ordinary people could interpret the Bible for themselves. A good speaker, she held meetings to which more and more women came, and even a few men. And soon groups of 60 or more were gathering at her home in Boston to listen to her criticisms of local ministers. I love it. John Winthrop, the governor, described her as a woman of a haughty and fierce carriage, of a nimble wit and active spirit, and a very voluble tongue, more bold than a man, though in understanding and judgment inferior to many women. And Hutchinson was put on trial twice, by the church for heresy and by the government for challenging their authority. At her civil trial, she was pregnant and ill, but they did not allow her to sit down until she was close to collapse. At her religious trial, she was interrogated for weeks, and again she was sick, but challenged her questioners with expert knowledge of the Bible and remarkable eloquence. When finally she repented in writing, they were not satisfied. They said, her repentance is not in her countenance. She was banished from the colony. Excuse me. Can you hear that? She was banished from the colony, and when she left for Rhode Island in 1638, 35 families followed her. Then she went to the shores of Long Island, where Indians who had been defrauded of their land thought she was one of their enemies. They killed her and her family. Oh, that sucks. 20 years later, the one person back in Massachusetts Bay who had spoken up for her during her trial, Mary Dyer, was hanged by the government of the colony along with 2 other Quakers for rebellion, sedition, and presumptuous obtruding themselves. I'm not even sure what that means. Presumptuous obtruding themselves. It remained rare for women to participate openly in public affairs, although on the southern and western frontiers, conditions made this occasionally possible. Julia Spruill found in Georgia's early records the story of Mary Musgrove Matthews, daughter of an Indian mother and an English father, who could speak the Creek language and became an advisor on Indian affairs to Governor James Oglethorpe of Georgia. Spruill finds that as the communities became more settled, women were thrust back farther from public life and seemed to behave more timorously than before. One petition: it is not the province of our sex to reason deeply upon the policy of the order. During the Revolution, however, Sproul reports the necessities of war brought women out into public affairs. Women formed patriotic groups, carried out anti-British actions, wrote articles for independence. They were active in the campaign against the British tea tax, which made tea prices intolerably high. They organized Daughters of Liberty groups, boycotting British goods, urging women to make their own clothes and buy only American-made things. In 1777, there was a women's counterpart to the Boston Tea Party, a coffee party, described by Abigail Adams in a letter to her husband John. One eminent, wealthy, stingy merchant, who was a bachelor, had a hogshead of coffee in his store, which he refused to sell the committee under 6 shillings per pound. A number of females, some say 100, some say more, assembled with a cart and trunks, marched down to that warehouse and demanded the keys, which he refused to deliver, upon which one of them seized him by the neck and tossed him into the cart. Sorry. Upon his finding no quarter, he delivered the keys when they tipped up the cart and discharged him. Then opened the warehouse, hoisted out the coffee themselves, put it into the trunks and drove off. A large concourse of men stood amazed, silent spectators of the whole transaction. And no wonder. It had been pointed out by women historians recently that the contributions of working class women in the American Revolution had been mostly ignored. Unlike the genteel wives of the leaders, Dolly Madison, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, Margaret Corbin called Dirty Kate, Deborah Sampson Garnett, and Molly Pitcher were rough lower-class women prettified into ladies by historians, while poor women in the last years of the fighting went to army encampments, helped and fought. They were represented later as prostitutes, whereas Martha Washington was given a special place in history books for visiting her husband at Valley Forge. When feminist impulses are recorded, they are almost always the writings of privileged women who had some status from which to speak freely, more opportunity to write and have their writings recorded. Abigail Adams, even before the Declaration of Independence in March of 1776, you knew when the Declaration of Independence was, wrote to her husband, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention are not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound to obey the laws in which we have no voice of representation." Nevertheless, Jefferson underscored his phrase, "all men are created equal," by his statement that American women would be too wise to wrinkle their foreheads with politics. And after the Revolution, none of the new state constitutions granted women the right to vote, except for New Jersey, and that state rescinded the right in 1807. New York's constitution specifically disenfranchised women by using the word male. While perhaps 90% of the white male population were literate around 1750, only 40% of the women were. Working class women had little means of communicating and no means of recording whatever sentiments of rebelliousness they may have felt at their subordination. Not only were they bearing children in great numbers under great hardships, but they were working in the home. Around the time of the Declaration of Independence, 4,000 women and children in Philadelphia were spinning at home for local plants under the putting out system. Women also were shopkeepers and innkeepers and engaged in many trades. They were bakers, tin workers, brewers, tanners, rope makers, lumberjacks, printers, morticians, woodworkers, staymakers, and more. Ideas of female equality were in the air during and after the Revolution. Tom Paine spoke out for the equal rights of women, and the pioneering book of Molly Wollstonecraft in England, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, was reprinted in the United States shortly after the Revolutionary War. Wollstonecraft was responding to the English conservative and opponent of the French Revolution, Edmund Burke, who had written in his Reflections on the Revolution in France that a woman is but an animal, and an animal not of the highest order. She wrote, "I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength, both of mind and body, and to convince them that soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, and that those beings who are only the objects of pity in that kind of love will soon become objects of contempt. I wish to show that the first object of laudable ambition is to obtain a character as a human being, regardless of the distinction of sex." Thank you for joining me. I hope you'll tune in for the next episode. Hit that like and subscribe button, and don't forget that notification bell, because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.